She was 7 years old the first time she heard it. The sound came floating through the air on a warm summer evening, and it stopped her right in the middle of the sidewalk. Her mother tugged at her hand, telling her to keep walking, but she couldn't move. Her feet were frozen to the ground. It was a violin. Someone was playing inside the old concert hall across the street. The doors were propped open because of the heat, and the music spilled out onto the street, like water flowing from a fountain. She had never heard anything so beautiful in her entire life. It made her chest feel tight. It made her eyes water. She didn't understand why, but something deep inside her woke up at that moment. Something that would never go back to sleep. Her mother finally pulled her away, and they continued walking home. But she kept looking back over her shoulder until the concert hall disappeared from view. That night, she lay in bed and replayed the sound in her head over and over again. She pressed her small fingers against her blanket, pretending she was the one making that beautiful music. She fell asleep, dreaming of violins. But here's the thing about dreams. Sometimes they choose people who seem like the worst possible candidates to carry them. And life had already decided to make her path harder than most. She was born with a condition that affected her nervous system. The doctors explained it to her parents, using big medical words. But the simple truth was this: her brain and her muscles didn't always communicate the way they should. Her hands would shake without warning. Her fingers would sometimes refuse to do what she told them to do. Simple tasks that other children did without thinking required enormous effort from her. When she was a toddler, learning to hold a spoon took months. Buttoning her own shirt was a battle she fought every single morning. Writing her name at school was an exhausting exercise that left her hand cramping and her eyes filled with frustrated tears. The other kids would finish their worksheets and run out to play while she was still struggling with the first few letters. The doctors were honest with her parents. They said she would always have limitations. They said her motor control would never be normal. They said she should focus on activities that didn't require fine hand coordination. They meant well. They were trying to protect her from disappointment, but their words became a kind of prison that everyone expected her to live inside. 2 years after that evening outside the concert hall, she finally gathered the courage to ask. She was 9 years old, sitting at the dinner table, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She wanted to learn the violin. The silence that followed her words was painful. Her parents looked at each other across the table. She saw something pass between them. It was worry. It was doubt. It was fear. Her father cleared his throat and changed the subject. Her mother smiled a sad smile and suggested that maybe she would enjoy painting instead. Something less demanding. Something where her hands wouldn't need to be so precise. She didn't argue. She just nodded and finished her dinner. But later that night, she cried into her pillow until she had no tears left. Still, she didn't give up. A few weeks later, her mother took her to a music school to inquire about lessons. Maybe there was a way, her mother thought. Maybe it was worth asking. The violin teacher was an older woman with gray hair and kind eyes. She asked the girl to hold out her hands. She watched as the slight tremor became visible. She asked her to touch each finger to her thumb, one by one, as quickly as she could. The girl tried her best, but her fingers moved slowly and unevenly, stumbling over each other like they were confused about where to go. The teacher let out a long breath. She looked at the mother with sympathy in her eyes. Then she bent down to the girl's level and spoke in a gentle voice. The violin, she explained, was one of the most demanding instruments in the world. It required absolute precision. It required fingers that could move with perfect control, pressing strings at exact locations measured in tiny fractions of an inch. It required hands that could stay steady while drawing a bow across the strings with consistent pressure. Even children with perfect motor skills struggled for years before they could play properly. She was very sorry, she said, but perhaps there were other instruments. Perhaps a drum, where precision was less important. Perhaps she could simply enjoy listening to music instead of trying to make it. The girl said nothing. She just nodded politely and followed her mother out of the music school. She held her mother's hand as they walked to the car. She stayed quiet the entire drive home. That night, something changed inside her. The rejection didn't kill her dream. Instead, It made it burn hotter. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and a thought formed in her mind that would shape the rest of her life. Everyone kept telling her what she couldn't do. They kept drawing lines around her and saying she had to stay inside them. But what if they were wrong? What if the limits they saw weren't real? What if the only thing truly holding her back was the fact that everyone expected her to fail? She didn't have the words to express this at 9 years old. She just felt it. A quiet rebellion taking root in her chest. From that day forward, she started paying attention to her hands in a new way. Instead of seeing them as broken things that didn't work right, she started studying them like puzzles that needed solving. She noticed that her tremors were worse when she was tired or stressed. She noticed that certain movements were harder than others. She noticed that when she concentrated very deeply and moved very slowly, she had more control. She started practicing in secret. Not violin, because she didn't have one. But she practiced holding things steady. She practiced moving her fingers one at a time. She practiced pinching small objects and holding them without dropping them. She turned her daily struggles into training exercises. At school, while other kids rushed through their handwriting assignments, she forced herself to slow down and focus. She started finishing last on purpose. Not because she couldn't go faster, but because she was teaching herself control. She was building something. She didn't know exactly what yet, but she could feel it growing. Her parents noticed the change in her, but they didn't understand it. She seemed more determined, more focused, but also more distant. She spent hours alone in her room with the door closed. When they asked what she was doing, she just said homework. They worried about her, but they didn't push. What they didn't know was that their daughter had made a decision. She was going to play the violin. She didn't know how. She didn't know when. But she knew it was going to happen. The world had told her no. The doctors had told her no. The music teacher had told her no. Even her own hands seemed to tell her no every single day. But deep inside, in a place that nobody could see or touch, she had already said yes. And that yes was louder than all the no's combined. She just had to find a way to prove it. And she was willing to wait as long as it took. 5 years passed. 5 years of waiting. 5 years of secret practice. 5 years of watching her classmates take music lessons while she pretended she didn't care. But the dream never faded. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year. By the time she turned 14, she understood something important. Nobody was going to hand her this dream. Nobody was going to suddenly change their mind and say, yes, go ahead, learn the violin. If she wanted it, she would have to take it herself. And that meant she needed money. She started looking for ways to earn whatever she could. After school, she walked dogs for neighbors. There was an elderly woman 3 houses down who had a small terrier that needed walking twice a day. The woman paid her a little bit each week, and she saved every single coin. On weekends, she helped another neighbor with yard work, raking leaves, pulling weeds, watering plants. It wasn't much money, but it added up. She also started tutoring younger kids in math. She wasn't a genius or anything, but she was patient, and she had a way of explaining things that made sense to struggling students. Word spread among the parents in her neighborhood, and soon she had 2 regular students who came to her house twice a week. She charged a small fee and put everything into a jar hidden in the back of her closet. Her parents thought she was just being responsible. They praised her for learning the value of hard work. They had no idea what she was saving for. Months went by. The jar grew heavier. She counted the money every night before bed, watching the total climb higher and higher. She had researched the cost of violins online. New ones were far too expensive, but used ones, old ones, scratched and worn ones, those were sometimes affordable. She just needed a little more time. Then, one Saturday afternoon, she found it. There was a pawn shop downtown that she passed sometimes when running errands with her mother. She had started stopping by the window whenever she could, looking at the random collection of items displayed behind the glass. Old watches, dusty electronics, forgotten jewelry, and sometimes, musical instruments. That Saturday, she saw it sitting in the corner of the window display. A violin. It looked old. The wood was scratched in several places, and the case it sat in was worn and faded. But to her, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She went inside and asked how much. The man behind the counter looked at her with bored eyes and named a price. It was almost exactly what she had saved. Her heart nearly exploded in her chest. She ran home. She grabbed the jar from her closet. She counted the money one more time just to be sure. Then she ran back to the pawn shop, out of breath and sweating, terrified that someone else might have bought it while she was gone. But it was still there. She handed over the crumpled bills and watched as the man placed the violin in its case and slid it across the counter toward her. Her hands were shaking as she picked it up, and for once, the shaking had nothing to do with her condition. It was pure excitement. She smuggled it into the house and hid it under her bed. That night, after her parents went to sleep, she pulled it out and just held it. She ran her fingers over the scratched wood. She touched the strings gently. She lifted the bow and felt its weight in her hand. This was real. This was actually happening. The next day, she started teaching herself. She found tutorials online. Free videos posted by music teachers and professional violinists. She watched them over and over again, pausing and rewinding, studying every detail. How to hold the instrument, how to position the bow, where to place her fingers on the strings. The first time she tried to play a note, the sound that came out was terrible. It was scratchy and weak and nothing like the beautiful music she remembered from that summer evening years ago. But she didn't care. She tried again, and again, and again. She practiced in secret every chance she got. When her parents were at work, when they thought she was doing homework, late at night with her door locked and a towel stuffed under the crack to muffle the sound, she became an expert at hiding, at lying about where her time went, at pretending everything was normal when her whole world had changed. Progress came slowly, painfully slowly. Her condition made everything 10 times harder than it should have been. Her fingers refused to land in the right spots. Her bow hand trembled and produced shaky, uneven sounds. Some days, her hands were so uncooperative that she couldn't play at all. She would just sit on her bed, holding the violin, crying silently, wondering if everyone had been right about her. But then she would think about all those people who said no. The doctors, the music teacher, even her own parents. And something stubborn inside her would flare up. She would wipe her tears and pick up the bow again. She started developing her own methods. When the standard finger positions didn't work for her hands, she experimented with alternatives. She discovered that warming up her hands in hot water before practicing reduced the tremors. She learned that playing very slowly at first helped her muscles remember the movements. She found that certain times of day were better than others. When her body was more cooperative, her fingers bled sometimes. The strings cut into her soft skin until calluses finally formed. Her shoulders and neck ached from holding the instrument in position. Her arms burned from the repetitive motion of bowing, but she kept going. Weeks turned into months. The terrible scratching sounds slowly transformed into something almost recognizable as music. She learned her first simple song. It took her 3 months to get through it without major mistakes. 3 months for a piece that most beginners learned in 2 weeks. But when she finally played it all the way through, she felt like she had conquered a mountain. She started learning more songs, harder ones. She pushed herself constantly, always reaching for the next challenge before she had fully mastered the current one. Her progress was uneven. Some weeks, she improved dramatically. Other weeks, her condition would flare up and she would lose ground. There were moments when she almost gave up. One night, after a particularly bad practice session where her hands refused to cooperate at all, she put the violin back in its case and shoved it under her bed. She told herself she was done. This was stupid. Everyone was right. She was never going to be able to do this. She didn't touch the violin for 2 whole weeks. She tried to forget about it. She tried to convince herself that she didn't care anymore. But the silence was worse than the struggle. The absence of music left a hole in her chest that nothing else could fill. She missed the feeling of the instrument in her hands. She missed the challenge. She even missed the frustration. On the 15th day, She pulled the case back out. She opened it and looked at the old scratched violin waiting patiently inside. It hadn't given up on her, and she realized she couldn't give up on it either. She picked up the bow and started again. 2 years went by like this. 2 years of secret practice. 2 years of slow, painful progress. 2 years of hiding who she really was from everyone around her. By the time she turned 16, something had changed. The sounds coming from her room late at night were no longer scratchy or weak. They were rich and warm and full of emotion. She had fought for every single note. She had earned every beautiful sound with blood and sweat and tears. And she was finally ready for the world to hear what she could do. She found out about the audition by accident. She was walking past the community center one afternoon when a flyer taped to the window caught her eye. The City Youth Orchestra was holding open auditions. Anyone between the ages of 14 and 19 could try out. No formal training required. All they asked was that you bring your instrument and play your best. She stood there staring at that flyer for a long time. Her heart was beating fast. Her hands started to tremble. And this time, it was fear, not her condition. For 2 years, she had been hiding, practicing in secret, playing for an audience of one. The thought of standing in front of actual judges and performing made her stomach twist into knots. But another part of her knew this was the moment she had been working toward. What was the point of learning to play if nobody ever heard her? What was the point of fighting so hard if she never stepped into the arena? She pulled out her phone and took a picture of the flyer. Then she walked home with her mind racing. The audition was in 3 weeks. 3 weeks to prepare. 3 weeks to choose the right piece. 3 weeks to somehow find the courage to do the scariest thing she had ever done. She practiced harder than ever before. She picked a piece that showed off her strengths while hiding her weaknesses. She played it hundreds of times, until her fingers knew every note by memory. She practiced in front of her bedroom mirror, trying to control her facial expressions, trying to look calm even when she was terrified inside. The night before the audition, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, imagining everything that could go wrong. Her hands could shake at the worst possible moment. She could forget the notes. The judges could take one look at her and dismiss her before she even started. She almost convinced herself to stay home. But when morning came, she got out of bed. She got dressed. She took her old scratched violin out from under her bed and put it in its worn case, and she walked out the door before she could change her mind. She had to tell her parents something. So she said she was going to a friend's house to study. They didn't question it. They had no idea that their daughter was about to do the bravest thing of her life. The community center was crowded when she arrived. Dozens of young musicians were warming up in the hallways, filling the air with a chaotic mix of sounds. She saw expensive instruments in pristine cases. She saw kids who carried themselves with the confidence of years of professional training. She saw parents hovering nearby, offering encouragement and last-minute advice. She was alone. Her violin was old and scratched. She had never had a single formal lesson. For a moment, she felt completely out of place, like she had made a terrible mistake by coming here, but she had come too far to turn back now. She signed in at the registration table and received a number, 47. She found a quiet corner and sat down to wait. The minutes crawled by like hours. She watched other musicians go in and come out. Some looked happy. Some looked disappointed. All of them looked like they belonged here more than she did. Finally, they called her number. She walked into the audition room on shaky legs. 3 judges sat behind a long table. Papers and pencils spread out in front of them. They looked tired. They had already seen dozens of performers today. She was just another face, another number, another few minutes of their time. One of the judges glanced up and noticed the way she was holding her violin case. He saw the slight tremor in her hands. His eyebrows went up just a little. She caught the look and felt her heart sink. He had already noticed. He was already judging her. She walked to the center of the room and set down her case. She opened it and lifted out her old violin. She saw the judges exchange glances when they noticed the scratched wood and the worn strings. She knew what they were thinking. Who was this girl with her damaged instrument and her shaking hands? What was she doing here? She almost apologized. She almost explained her condition, made excuses before she even started. But something stopped her. She didn't want their pity. She didn't want them to lower their expectations. She wanted to be judged the same as everyone else, so she said nothing. She just positioned her violin, raised her bow, and closed her eyes. The first note rang out into the silence of the room. It was clear and pure and steady. She didn't think about the judges. She didn't think about her hands. She didn't think about anything except the music. She played the piece she had practiced hundreds of times. But something was different now. In her bedroom, alone with her mirror, she had played it correctly. Here, in front of these strangers who expected her to fail, she played it with her whole soul. Every struggle she had faced went into those notes. Every tear she had cried. Every night she had almost given up. Every morning she had chosen to keep going anyway. The music filled the room like a living thing. It told her story better than words ever could. It spoke of pain and hope and stubborn refusal to accept the limits others had placed on her. When she played the final note, she held it for a long moment before letting it fade into silence. Then she opened her eyes. The room was completely still. The judges were staring at her with expressions she couldn't read. For a horrible second, she thought she had done something wrong. Maybe it wasn't as good as she thought. Maybe she had embarrassed herself. Then she noticed that one of the judges, an older man with gray hair and glasses, had tears running down his cheeks. He wasn't even trying to hide them. He just sat there, looking at her like he had witnessed something impossible. Another judge, a woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, broke the silence. Her voice was soft, almost reverent. She asked how long she had been playing. The girl told her. 2 years. The woman's eyes widened. She asked who her teacher was. The girl said she didn't have one. She had taught herself. The woman leaned back in her chair and shook her head slowly, like she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. The third judge, a younger man who hadn't shown much expression until now, leaned forward. He asked about her hands. He had noticed the tremor. He wanted to understand, so she told them. She explained her condition. She explained how doctors had said she would never have normal motor control. She explained how a music teacher had turned her away at age 9. She explained the years of secret practice, the bleeding fingers, the nights of crying, the moments of almost giving up. When she finished, the room was silent again. The judges looked at each other. Something unspoken passed between them. The older man with the gray hair spoke. His voice was thick with emotion. He said that in 30 years of judging auditions, he had never heard anything like what she had just played. He said that music was not just about technical perfection. It was about heart, and she had more heart than anyone he had ever seen. They didn't just accept her into the orchestra. They offered her the first chair violin position, the highest honor they could give. She walked out of that room in a daze. She couldn't believe what had just happened. For years, the world had told her she couldn't do this. And now, in the space of a few minutes, everything had changed. Word spread quickly. A local newspaper heard about the girl who had taught herself violin despite her condition and won first chair at the youth orchestra. They sent a reporter to interview her. The story ran the following week, along with her picture on the front page of the arts section. Then the story got picked up by bigger outlets. A video of her practicing, filmed by a friend on a phone camera, was posted online. Within days, it had been viewed over 1 million times. Comments poured in from around the world. People were moved by her story. People were inspired. People who had been told they couldn't do something saw her and thought maybe they could. The girl who everyone said would never play had suddenly become someone the whole world was watching. And she was only getting started. She thought the hard part was over. She thought that once the world saw what she could do, everything would get easier. She was wrong. Success brought attention, and attention brought opinions. Not all of them were kind. At first, the response to her story was overwhelmingly positive. People sent messages of support and admiration. They called her an inspiration. They shared her video with friends and family. She felt like she was floating on a cloud of love from strangers around the world. But then the other voices started creeping in. Some people didn't believe her story was real. They left comments saying it was exaggerated, that no one could teach themselves violin to that level in just 2 years. They said she must have had secret lessons. They said someone was lying to make her look more impressive than she really was. Others were crueler. They mocked her condition. They said she was using her disability to get sympathy votes. They called her a charity case who didn't deserve her position in the orchestra. They said real musicians who had trained for years were being pushed aside so people could feel good about supporting the girl with the sad story. She tried not to read the comments. Everyone told her to ignore the negativity. But it was impossible. The hateful words found their way to her. No matter how hard she tried to avoid them, they crawled into her mind late at night when she was trying to sleep. They whispered in her ear when she picked up her violin to practice. Maybe they were right. Maybe she didn't really deserve this. Maybe she had just gotten lucky. The pressure mounted as her first performance with the youth orchestra approached. She practiced constantly, pushing herself harder than ever. She wanted to prove that she belonged. She wanted to silence the doubters once and for all. The concert went well. Not perfect, but well. She made a few small mistakes that only trained ears would notice. The audience applauded warmly. Her parents, who finally knew the truth about her secret violin journey, sat in the front row with tears in their eyes. It should have been one of the happiest nights of her life, but afterward, she saw a review posted online. A music critic had attended the concert. He praised the orchestra overall, but singled her out. He said her technique was unpolished. He said her position as first chair was clearly a publicity decision rather than a merit-based one. He said the orchestra was sacrificing excellence for a feel-good story. The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. She read the review over and over, each time feeling worse. She had worked so hard. She had given everything she had. And still, it wasn't enough. More reviews followed, and they were mixed. Some praised her passion and emotion. Others criticized her technical limitations. The debate about whether she deserved her position grew louder. She became a controversy instead of just a musician. She started doubting herself constantly. Every time she picked up her violin, she heard the critics in her head. Her playing became tense and fearful. The joy that had always carried her through began to fade. Music started feeling like a burden instead of a gift. And then, the worst thing imaginable happened. It started with a tingling sensation in her fingers that wouldn't go away. At first, she ignored it. She had dealt with her condition her whole life. She knew how to push through discomfort, but this was different. The tingling grew stronger. Her hands started shaking more than usual. Some mornings, she could barely close her fingers into a fist. She went to the doctor, hoping it was nothing serious, but the news was devastating. Her condition was progressing. The nerve damage was getting worse. The doctor said she needed to rest completely. No violin, no practice, no performances. If she kept pushing, she could cause permanent damage. She asked how long she would need to rest. The doctor hesitated before answering. Weeks at minimum, possibly months. And even then, there was no guarantee she would recover enough to play at the level she had reached. She sat in the car after that appointment and cried until she had nothing left. Everything she had worked for was slipping away. The universe had let her taste her dream, and now it was snatching it back. It felt unbearably cruel. The weeks that followed were the darkest of her life. She had to withdraw from the orchestra. She had to watch from the sidelines as another musician took her chair. She had to explain to reporters and supporters that she was taking a break for health reasons, without knowing if she would ever come back. Her violin sat in the corner of her room, untouched. She couldn't even look at it without feeling a wave of grief. It was like losing a part of herself. Depression settled over her like a heavy blanket. She stopped going out. She stopped talking to friends. She spent hours in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what the point of anything was. She had fought so hard to prove everyone wrong, and in the end, maybe they had been right all along. Maybe some dreams weren't meant to come true. Her parents didn't know how to help. They tried to encourage her, but their words felt empty. They suggested other hobbies, other paths she could take. But she didn't want another path. She wanted music. She wanted her violin. She wanted the one thing she couldn't have. 3 months passed. 3 months of silence and stillness and despair. She went through the motions of daily life, but she felt hollow inside. The fire that had burned in her since she was 7 years old seemed to have gone out completely. Then one afternoon, something unexpected happened. Her mother called her downstairs. There was a package at the door. Actually, there were several packages, and a bag full of envelopes. She didn't understand. She hadn't ordered anything. But when she opened the first envelope, she found a handwritten letter from a girl in another country. The girl was 13 years old and had been born with a similar condition. She wrote about how she had seen the viral video and how it had changed her life. For the first time, she believed she could pursue her dream of becoming an artist, despite what doctors had told her. She wanted to say thank you. The next letter was from a father whose son used a wheelchair. He wrote about how his son had given up on everything until he saw her story. Now he was learning to paint using special brushes adapted for his hands. The father said she had given his child hope. Letter after letter told similar stories. People with disabilities who had been told they couldn't do things. People who had almost given up on their dreams. People who saw her and thought, if she can do it, maybe I can too. There were hundreds of letters. They came from all over the world. Some were written by children in messy handwriting. Some were typed by adults who had been carrying their impossible dreams for decades. All of them said the same thing in different words. You changed my life. You made me believe. Please don't give up. She sat on the living room floor surrounded by letters and cried. But these weren't tears of despair. They were tears of realization. She had been so focused on the critics, so beaten down by her own struggles, that she had forgotten something important. Her story was never just about her. Every time she picked up that violin, she was playing for every person who had ever been told they weren't good enough. Every note she fought to create was a message to the world that limits could be broken. Her music was bigger than her own dreams. It belonged to everyone who needed to believe that impossible things could happen. She looked at her hands. They were still weak. They still trembled. But they had carried her this far, and they would carry her further. She wasn't done fighting, not even close. Recovery was slow. There were no shortcuts, no miracles, no sudden breakthroughs. Just small steps forward, one painful day at a time. She started with physical therapy. Exercises designed to strengthen her hands and improve her coordination. Simple movements that felt humiliating at first. Squeezing soft balls, stretching her fingers one by one, picking up small objects and setting them down again. It felt like starting over from zero. Some days, progress was invisible. Her hands would shake just as badly as before, and she would wonder if any of this was making a difference. But she kept showing up. She kept doing the exercises. She kept believing that somewhere beneath the surface, healing was happening. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. The tingling in her fingers faded. Her grip grew stronger. The tremors, while still present, became less severe. Her doctors were cautiously optimistic. They said she was responding better than expected. They said she might be able to play again someday. Though they couldn't promise anything, someday wasn't good enough for her. She wanted more than someday. She wanted now. After 4 months of therapy, she finally allowed herself to open the violin case again. Her hands trembled as she lifted the instrument. It felt both familiar and foreign at the same time, like reuniting with an old friend after a long separation. She raised the bow and drew it across the strings. The sound that came out was rough and unsteady. Nothing like what she used to produce. Tears filled her eyes. But she didn't stop. She played one note, then another, then another. Each one was a small victory. She began practicing again, but differently than before. She couldn't push herself the way she used to. She had to listen to her body, respect its limits, and work within them instead of fighting against them. It required a new kind of patience, a new kind of discipline. She learned to measure progress in inches instead of miles. 6 months after her diagnosis, she received an invitation that made her heart stop. The International Classical Music Festival was one of the most prestigious events in the world. The greatest musicians on earth performed there. It was broadcast live to millions of people across dozens of countries, and somehow, they wanted her. The invitation explained that her story had touched people everywhere. The organizers wanted to give her a platform to share her music with the world. They were offering her a solo performance slot on the main stage. Her first instinct was to say no. She wasn't ready. She was still recovering. What if she got up there and failed in front of millions? What if her hands betrayed her at the worst possible moment? The risk was enormous. If she fell apart on that stage, it would undo everything she had built. The critics who said she didn't belong would finally be proven right. But then she thought about the letters. Hundreds of people who were watching her, waiting to see what she would do next. People who had found hope in her story. If she turned down this opportunity out of fear, what message would that send? That when things get hard, you should play it safe? That dreams have an expiration date? She said yes. The next 3 months were the most intense of her life. She worked with a coach for the first time ever. Someone who specialized in adaptive techniques for musicians with physical challenges. She practiced every single day, carefully balancing the need to improve with the need to protect her healing hands. She chose to perform an original composition, a piece she wrote herself that told the story of her journey through music. The night before the performance, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, running through the piece in her mind, her fingers twitching against the blanket. Fear and excitement battled inside her chest. This was it. Everything she had worked for, everything she had survived, came down to tomorrow. Morning arrived too quickly. She traveled to the concert hall in a daze. The building was enormous, far bigger than anywhere she had ever performed. Backstage, she saw famous musicians she had only ever watched on screens. They walked past her like she was invisible. She felt small and out of place. Her parents had flown in to watch. They found her backstage before the show and hugged her tight. Her mother's eyes were already wet with tears. Her father told her he was proud of her no matter what happened tonight. She held on to those words like a lifeline. The hours crept by. She warmed up carefully, protecting her hands, saving her strength. She could hear the crowd filling the concert hall. Thousands of people taking their seats. The sound was like a distant ocean, waves of murmuring voices and rustling programs. Then it was time. She walked onto that stage and felt the heat of the spotlights on her face. The audience stretched out before her, a vast sea of shadowy figures. Cameras pointed at her from every angle, broadcasting her image to millions of homes around the world. For a moment, the fear was so intense, she forgot how to breathe. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling. Of course they were trembling. They had always trembled. But they had also carried her through every impossible moment of her life. They had refused to give up, even when her mind wanted to quit. They were not her weakness. They were her greatest strength. She lifted her violin and positioned it against her shoulder. She raised her bow. The concert hall fell completely silent. Thousands of people held their breath, and she began to play. The first notes floated out into the vastness of the hall, soft and delicate, like the first light of dawn. The piece started slowly, telling the story of a little girl who heard a violin through an open window and fell in love with a sound she was told she could never make. The music grew stronger, more complex, reflecting the years of secret practice, the bleeding fingers, the hidden tears. It captured the loneliness of fighting a battle that nobody else could see. Then came the dark passage, the part of the composition that represented her illness, her despair, the months when she thought everything was lost. The notes twisted and struggled, full of pain and uncertainty. Some people in the audience wiped tears from their eyes, but the music didn't stay in darkness. It began to climb, note by note, measure by measure, rising toward something brighter. The melody transformed into something triumphant, something unstoppable. It was the sound of someone refusing to be defeated, the sound of hope that survives against all odds. She played the final movement with everything she had. Her bow flew across the strings. Her fingers danced with precision she didn't know she still possessed. The music soared through the concert hall like a bird finally set free. When the last note rang out, she held it until it faded into perfect silence. For a moment, nothing happened. The world stood still. Then the audience erupted. The applause was deafening. People leaped to their feet. The standing ovation spread across the entire concert hall like a wave. Row after row rising to honor what they had just witnessed. The applause went on and on. 5 minutes, 7 minutes, 9 minutes, showing no signs of stopping. She stood on that stage with tears streaming down her face, unable to process what was happening. She saw her parents in the front row, sobbing and clapping. She saw strangers with their hands raised above their heads, cheering for a girl they had never met. In homes around the world, people watched on their screens and felt something shift inside them. Comment sections exploded. With messages of awe and inspiration, the video of her performance would go on to be viewed hundreds of millions of times. It would be called one of the greatest comeback stories in the history of music. But in that moment, she wasn't thinking about any of that. She was thinking about a 7-year-old girl standing on a sidewalk, frozen in place, hearing a violin for the first time. She was thinking about everyone who had told that girl no. And she was thinking about the quiet voice inside that little girl's heart that had whispered yes anyway. They said she would never play. She just proved the entire world wrong.